All right, you ready? The nation of Chad is landlocked. It's right smack dab in the heart of Africa. If you are in Chad and you want to go to the ocean, it is a very, very long way. And honestly, that's the least of Chad's problems. Chad is one of the poorest countries on earth. It's considered to be one of the most corrupt countries on earth in terms of its government. It's been run by the same dictator for more than 25 years. And the rest of the world, sadly, has never much cared, no matter how bad things were, no matter how bad things got in the nation of Chad. But in the early 2000s, it suddenly became a huge, urgent deal of international concern that Chad was landlocked, that Chad doesn't touch the sea. It's always been true. But that became a huge new international crisis that all sorts of people were paying attention to in the early 2000s. Because in the early 2000s, that is when Chad struck oil. And that changes everything. Usually it doesn't change things for the better. Over and over and over again, all over the world, you know, on the surface, you'd think that discovering oil or discovering gold, discovering some other thing that makes people rich, you'd think that would be a good thing for a poor country to discover. More often, though, when a poor country discovers a resource like that, it actually makes things worse in that poor country. That happens enough that that phenomenon has a name. They call it the resource curse. It's a known thing. And so when one of the poorest countries on the planet, when Chad struck oil big time in the early 2000s, there was an effort to help them avoid the resource curse, to have Chad do it right. And so they made a deal. If Chad agreed that all of its soon-to-be new oil money, its new oil revenue, if they agreed that that money wouldn't just be taken by the dictator and his family, if they agreed that the dictator wouldn't just use all the new oil money to build himself a big new army and buy lots of weapons to wage war on his enemies and keep himself in power, if Chad agreed to that, if Chad agreed to spend constructively for the benefit of the people of that country when it got its new oil money, then they would get this great deal. And that great deal would start with Chad no longer being landlocked. It would start with the oil companies building Chad a pipeline to the sea. So at least its oil would no longer be landlocked. Chad would let oil companies like Chevron and Exxon come in and drill oil. The country would get a big cut of the oil revenue. You mix that in with a big financial aid package for the country as well, and you ultimately get a big happy deal, right? Think about the components of this deal. The previously untapped oil gets drilled. The oil gets piped through the new pipeline to the sea, so it can be shipped out to market. So the oil companies make a killing on that. The government gets a whole bunch of international aid as part of this deal. And, of course, they get lots of new oil revenue. And because of the deal, the people of the country are guaranteed by the terms of this deal that all the new oil money, all these new oil revenues coming into the country, they won't just go into the dictator's pocket. They won't just turn into tanks and weapons. They'll be spent on things like education and hospitals and basic infrastructure to improve people's quality of life. So for the oil companies, for the government, for the people, right? Great deal. The World Bank and the U.S. government brokered it because the U.S. had a stake in this as well. The U.S. has a stake in poor countries of the world, particularly in unstable parts of the world where there's a lot of extremism. It has a stake in those countries developing, in those countries being more stable, in those countries doing more for their own people. And so the World Bank and the U.S. government brokered this deal once that oil was discovered in Chad. And the oil started pumping in 2003. And when you compare the numbers from before they started pumping the oil and after, Chad's GDP quintupled within 10 years. But you know what happened there? Once all that money started flowing in, the dictator in Chad decided that he didn't actually really like this deal anymore. Because, yeah, health and education for the people might be nice ideas for America and the World Bank, right, who were pushing this deal. But if you're a dictator in your second decade in charge, and you're planning on many more decades in charge, you may not be nearly as psyched as America is about, prioritizing the education of your people over what is your priority, which in this case was weapons. He wants a bigger military. He wants more firepower. He wants more guns. Yeah, there was this deal that you have to spend the money on education and hospitals and stuff. But if there really is a big faucet of oil money flowing into his country, what the dictator really wanted, what he really wanted for that money, what he really wanted to spend it on was guns. And that was prohibited by the deal. And so he threw the deal out the window. Forget the deal. Forget the World Bank and the United States that brokered the deal. Forget you. The deal's off. Or at least we're going to do a new deal. And on August 26th, 2006, the dictator of Chad told these two oil companies, told Chevron and Petronas, two of the three oil companies that were in on this giant deal, he told them they had to get out of Chad. In fact, he gave them 1 day to get out of Chad. He said they had to be gone within 24 hours. But it's interesting. He only kicked out two of the three companies that were pumping oil in his country. The other company, they could stay. Really? Yes. And say it with me now. That company was Exxon. Because the new deal that he was making, after throwing out this old deal, the new deal he wanted to make was really just with Exxon. Exxon basically told the dictator in Chad, hey, listen, we're not the World Bank. We're not the United States. Do a deal with us. Right? You get oil money from us pumping out your oil. We're not going to tell you where to spend it, how to spend it. Screw the deal that you had to make with these other people. You just deal with us. We'll get the oil. You can have the cash. Call the deal off. You can, pay off whatever loans you agreed to as part of this deal. We're happy for your business. We're Exxon. We'll take your oil. We will give you money for your oil. And then once you've got that money, you get your guns or whatever it is you want. That'll be the term of the deal. And so that was the new deal. And the United States of America was left standing on the sideline. Because what's the United States of America going to do in this instance? I mean, they were up against the Death Star. Steve Cole points out in his book, Private Empire, that the total of U.S. aid in Chad, the total of American aid that we spend in that country, foreign aid and military aid even, the total less than $20 million. While Exxon is paying them more than $500 million a year in oil revenue. So yeah, guess who gets to make the deals in that country? And there are humanitarian concerns there. There's an opportunity there to help one of the 10 poorest nations on Earth in one of the most volatile and dangerous regions on Earth. Screw that. Are you kidding? Move over, Bacon. Now there's something meatier. And that whole Exxon move, that all happened in 2006. That happened right after this guy took over as the head of Exxon. This deal in Chad. Screw the U.S. government. Screw what the United States of America is trying to accomplish in that part of Africa, in that critical part of the world. Chad borders Libya and Nigeria and Sudan, right? Screw whatever that little country means to the United States, and screw whatever that other little country, the United States, is trying to do here. Get out of the way. There's money to be made here for Exxon. And now, more than a dozen years into its new life as an oil-producing nation, if you look at the Human Development Index of nations, Chad ranks 4th from the bottom out of 188 countries. Remember I said their GDP quintupled? Didn't do much for the people. 4th from the bottom. There's 188 countries ranked. They're 185th. Chad is also officially considered to be a failed state. Chad remains one of the 10 poorest nations on Earth, remains one of the most corrupt nations on Earth. In fact, the single poorest inhabited region on Earth is a part of Chad, a region in Chad that's called Salamat. See down in the lower east, southeast corner there? Salamat, the poorest region on the face of the globe that is inhabited by humans. And Salamat is just a hop, skip, and a jump from Exxon's largest oil field in Chad. But Exxon is doing great in Chad. Their latest corporate report says that just in that one field in Chad that's next to the poorest region on the face of the earth, they're producing 29 million barrels of oil. And under the new deal that Exxon cut, that oil flow out of the ground in Chad, which has been so good for Exxon, it has led to Chad's dictator spending at least $4 billion on weapons. And that is something that the United States government saw coming and tried to prevent, because it is not in the interest of the United States. The reason it happened anyway is because it was in the interests of Exxon. And Exxon has its own foreign policy that is frequently at odds with the United States. And that foreign policy is the only foreign policy with which our new nominee for Secretary of State has any experience whatsoever. Today, the transition made it official that the president-elect has chosen Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson as his nominee to be the next Secretary of State of America. There's this hilarious period today when there was all this breathless reporting that former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and former Defense Secretary Bob Gates were both vocally on board with this controversial nomination. Wow, maybe it's not that controversial after all. Maybe it's not that weird that the CEO of Exxon would get a job like this. After all, Condi Rice and Bob Gates say they are on board. There was this hilarious period today between the start of that reporting and the moment when everybody finally Googled it and noticed, oh yeah, Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates are both consultants for Exxon now. They're both on the Exxon payroll. In fact, Politico reported not long ago that the whole reason the Exxon CEO even got a first look from the Trump transition, even got his first introduction to President-elect Donald Trump, is because Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates made that introduction. They work for Exxon. Do you think Exxon's getting its money worth for their consulting contract with Condi Rice and Bob Gates? They just got them a Secretary of State. So that's our new nominee for Secretary of State. In the wake of the formal announcement, there was obviously a lot of attention today to Rex Tillerson's exceedingly close relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. There was also starting to be some attention to the fact that while American soldiers were fighting and dying in Iraq to try to stand up an Iraqi government that could hold that country together after we deposed Saddam, while American soldiers were fighting and dying in Iraq to stand up an Iraqi government that can hold that country together, Exxon defied an explicit request from the U.S. government to please only work with the government in Baghdad. Exxon responded to that request from the U.S. government by saying, screw that. In effect, who cares what American soldiers are dying for? We're going to do our own deal, our own oil deal with just the Kurdish government in the northern part of Iraq, because that may be terrible for America, but that's easier for us. In the wake of the president-elect nominating this man who has never worked anywhere else in his life other than Exxon, there are a lot of interesting questions now as to whether he'll be confirmed. There are concerns about how much his life's work has had him working alongside and helping America's adversaries. But I think there's another point here that deserves a look, which is that what his history really is foreign. Foreign to the United States. I mean, the case the incoming administration is trying to make for Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State is that he's somehow perfectly suited to being America's top diplomat because he has been operating in other countries for a long time, as if he and Exxon have been some sort of private sector adjunct to the work of the Foreign Service and the State Department and the U.S. government. So clearly it'll be easy for him to step into running the State Department. But what he has actually been, in country after country, in story after story, in war after war, in deal after deal, what he's actually been really is an adversary of the United States. Exxon has its own foreign policy. That doesn't mean it's a good place to get training in how to do America's foreign policy. They compete with America. I mean, in lots of places, Exxon is anti-American. Exxon under Rex Tillerson has frequently and repeatedly and reliably actively worked to oppose the interests of the United States of America in countries large and small, even in countries where we are actively at war, even in countries most Americans couldn't find on a map.